Welcome. This is part 3 in our webinar series, Sharing Stories and Building Relationships with the Land. Today is our third installment of a 6-part series that runs through June 1st. And for those of you who might be new to the Zoom format, if you go to the bottom of your screen and you click on the chat icon, you'll be able to submit questions for our presenter. And this feature will help you do that. My name is Peg Vershawn, and I'm the Director of Programs here at CURE in Montevideo. CURE is an organization that's been around for about 25 years that works in climate, energy, and water, and is based right here in the Minnesota River Valley in Montevideo, Minnesota. The Sharing Stories series grew out of partnership with our We Are Water West Central Minnesota project this past year. And our shared goal for this series has been to amplify the stories of people who are using conservation practices with important regenerative potential while reducing the impacts of climate change. These practices improve soil health and water quality. They grow deep connections to the land and those who came before them. These stories are from practitioners, people with boots on the ground and soil underneath their fingernails. Together, these storytellers are from different backgrounds, cultures, and generations. We are at a critical moment where we need to hear perspectives of path builders who are catalyzing change for themselves and their communities. Today, we have Jessica Blair from Fire Rock Farm near Starbuck. Jess will dig into the challenges of converting their family's land from conventional farmland to pasture, all while raising 6 children. What are the challenges and the opportunities for women in agriculture, and what inspired her to want to be connected to the land and her animals in West Central Minnesota? Jess didn't grow up on a farm, but she decided to build one. So we're going to start today with an introductory video. If you, I'm hearing a little bit of distraction in the background, so just want to make sure that everybody stays muted. If you would please, and submit your questions in the chat for us, okay?
I'm Jessica Blair from Fire Rock Farm, and our farm is in Starbuck, Minnesota in Pope County. We run about 550 acres, mostly grazing acres. My husband also helps on the farm and has a construction company. We have 6 children ranging from 18 years old to 2 years old. We've been farming for about 15 years. We started with an organic mindset. It was a passion of mine to have a farm. I didn't grow up in a farm background, but my husband did. So we picked his brain a lot in the beginning. We are mostly pasture based. We've converted, most of our land was cropland in the past, or cropland when we bought it. We've converted most of it to pasture. I really enjoy just working with livestock. We've seen the huge benefits of getting livestock on the land. I'm not big into farming equipment and that sort of thing. I just like being out in nature. We've done some cover cropping on some of our acres when we have grown corn and various crops. We've had good luck with that, and really just, it was a way for us to get the livestock out on that cropping land.
Thank you, Jess. Welcome, and thanks for allowing us to be out on your farm and be able to share with our participants today a little bit of what it's like to be out at Fire Rock Farm. If you'd like to give us a few words about maybe your bio and a little bit that you want to share with us today, that would be great.
Okay. I know some of it there was covered in the video as far as our farm size and such, but we have about 40 cows that we calve out every year, and then I finish out the steers to raise for direct selling our beef. So that's basically farm to table on that. We also raise pigs that we buy as feeders and raise those up and just sell, usually 10 to 15 a year. Those are kind of on the smaller side. And then we also have sheep that we mostly sell the lambs on contract. We're kind of right at the tail end of lambing right now. We tend to lamb in February and March, and like those lambs to be big enough by the time the pastures are grown up to get those ewes back out on the land. So that time of year works well for us. Most of our lambs are sold on antibiotic-free contract. Yeah, that kind of sums up our operation, I guess.
So, sharing stories, growing relationships with the land is really a series that's lifting up folks that have taken conventional farmland and they've converted it to pasture for grazing. And what was that process like for you? And how long did it take? And how long have you been pasturing your animals?
It's been an ongoing process. We kind of started when we started farming. We started really small. I just kind of wanted food for our own family. We just started with a pasture-based system, and we were just renting a house with a little bit of pasture land at the time. And we've just slowly expanded over the years. We bought our current farm in 2009. Most of it had been conventionally farmed. It had been a dairy farm years before we bought it. And just kind of right away, we started in with wanting to do no-till farming. So we started with that and started kind of grazing the animals on the land immediately in certain areas. We started doing small grains, was kind of where we started a lot of our land at for chopping, and then we plant a cover crop into it. And then we get the animals out there to graze that cover crop in the fall. We've just slowly added to our farm over the years when something's come up available or if we've been able to rent more land. And we pretty much now with our newer pieces have typically just kind of jumped right into getting that conversion started. We added 150 acres a few years back. That was all, had never seen livestock before, all conventionally farmed, that we started by just haying it, planting alfalfa and haying it our first year just to kind of get a cover on it and still get some income off of it. And then from there, we've been planting cover crops into that and interseeding certain areas of it with grass. And we had cattle on there for the first time a couple years ago, and they'll go back there again this spring.
Great. You're talking a little bit about cover cropping. What kinds of crops are you guys using when you're rotating some of these cover crops in?
We had used a huge variety. It really just depended on the time of year that we were planting and the conditions at the time of planting. So anything, radish, turnips, oats, peas, sorghum. It's just been a huge variety. We found a seed company that we work with, and they've been really good about helping us decide what to put on our land and kind of, whatever our specific need is for that year. We've backed off a lot on the cover cropping and just really focused a little more as we've gone along on just getting that grass to grow and focusing a little heavier there. We've just found that to be a little bit more profitable. The cover crops definitely still have their place, but since we are not growing grain or doing any conventional farming for us at this time in our operation, it hasn't been as good of a tool as it was in the beginning when we were doing a few other growing small grains and things.
Sure. So you said you were using radish and different things like that. I think that probably is really instrumental in helping build soil health and getting the soil broken up and getting water to penetrate some of those
Mm-hmm.
layers of soil that might not have had deep root systems in them prior
Definitely.
to you planting your grasses and stuff. Um, you've talked about you might, I'm just guessing, have different kinds based on the parcel that you might be working with, different soil
Mm-hmm.
types. You might have different things you're working with. How have you watched what's happened with water on your property? Like maybe from when you start with a piece to what happens to water now that you've got your pasture maybe a little bit more established?
Yeah, we've seen huge changes. And again, we really have a variety of land as far as we have hilly and rocky with really, really light soil. We have some that has extremely heavy soil. And so it's been neat to see just how the land has responded in the with the different soil types using some similar practices. We've had to change it up a little bit between the type of land, but we had a piece that we bought in 2014 that was it had been farmed conventionally for less than 5 years. It was natives before that. And as soon as we bought it, we worked with NRCS and Fish and Wildlife and planted it back to natives and had a really good response on that piece. And they kind of think too, just because it hadn't been farmed for that long, we probably were kind of tapping into some of that seed bank that was already there along with what we planted. But in that 5 years, because that soil was so light and so sandy, it just really, there was so much erosion within the hillsides and that sort of thing. And it was just amazing how well it responded to being planted back to grass. And just those erosion areas, we're just not seeing it to the same level. It's still there's definitely still a little work to do out there, and we're kind of learning how to manage that particular piece with that lighter soil again, and figuring out the right rotation of livestock and that sort of thing. But that one's just been a really neat one to watch. In fact, when we first were going to buy that piece of land, our kids begged us not to because they were worried about all the rock picking they would have to do out there. So, and we've seen like some of our heavier land. That one's still the one I was talking about earlier. That 150 acres is really heavy. There's been less ponding out there. And it's been drying out a little quicker in the spring, but that one we're still pretty early in the process, and it just takes time. So I've just really learned a ton by going out during different, weather events or right after a weather event, and really observing just what's happening on the land, and where is that water running, where isn't it running, where did it used to run and it's not anymore. And so you can just learn so much by that, and then just make small changes over time.
That is one of the nice things about pasture is it tends to absorb the water in a rain event, and you don't see as much of it in the ditch or running off. So
Mm-hmm.
it's good to hear that you guys are experiencing that where you're at. I think one of the unique things about your operation that made us think that you'd be a good fit for this series was the fact that as a woman, you're the lead on your farm in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
you have your husband helps you, and he grew up on a farm, but
Mm-hmm.
he has another job, and that you kind of do the day-to-day work and work to make the decisions with him
Mm-hmm.
on the farm. So can you tell us a little bit about what that process was like for you initially? Like, you obviously were curious and had a passion for wanting to be on a farm, but was it intimidating? Um, how did you go about deciding this was something you wanted to try? And then did you have a mentor that you worked with, or two? Sometimes it takes
Yeah,
a village. I don't know.
it does. It does. Yeah, it was definitely a long process, and it was something that I'd always had an interest in being on a farm. I just didn't think that it was something that I could do because of not growing up on a farm. I just lack of knowledge and skill in that area. I grew up in town, and so it just felt a little bit overwhelming.
So I kind of restarted because I just wanted to grow healthy food for my family, and wanted to just have a hand in knowing what it meant to grow food. My mother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer and kind of started on a health journey after that diagnosis. And we just learned a lot through that process about human health and in the relation to farming and the way that food is grown. And that kind of became instrumental in us just changing the way we saw things, changing the way that our family was eating, and what initially sparked my interest. I did a lot of reading. I read a lot of Joel Salatin's books, and those were really helpful and kind of made me feel like we could at least get started without needing a lot of inputs, without a ton of knowledge, and just started signing up for any conferences I could find, like organic type conferences. I started collecting animals and just trying it out. And just, I just tell my husband one day, oh, we're going to get a milk cow and, we need to go pick it up here. And he was always pretty on board with it. And then he'd pretty much have to teach me how to take care of it once he had it. But I learned best by doing. And we just any classes that I could find, I would take. We invited so many farming friends over. Some were conventional farmers, some were organic farmers. I'd invite them over for supper and just, drill them on all kinds of questions and ask them why they were doing what they were doing and how they got started, and just learned a ton that way. I was pretty naive to the farming world in general, and sometimes I cringe a little bit at maybe some of the questions I asked or some of the things I said just out of a not knowing farm culture in general. But that was just, we had some amazing people who were willing to answer questions and be encouraging, just some really good friends along the way. That helped a lot. Or if I was, if we were having issues with an animal or whatever, I always had people I felt like I could call and find the answer to. A couple of years ago, I took the Soil Health Academy class that Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta put on down in Redwood Falls, and it's I think it was a 2.5-day event, and that was just really, really, really good. And I gained a ton of confidence from that, just as far as power of observation for really learning how to read and look at the land. So yeah, it just kind of came from every area.
It does, doesn't it? I think that once you get plugged into a network of people that you ask them questions about things that they're interested in, they're really pretty generous with their sharing and their knowledge. Did you like, one of the things when you're starting this process that seems to be overwhelming, especially if you don't come from a farming background, is and I'll say this from our perspective, we have a small family farm and we don't have any major equipment. We don't. And so, we have a few steers, we rotationally graze, we have some hogs that we pasture and put in the grove, and we have about 100 chickens. But we have a pickup truck and a trailer, so I really appreciate what you were sharing, because I think it's important for our listeners to hear that, like when we had trouble with a steer, we could call a friend that, had animals and ask questions to see if we needed to call the vet before we, engaged in a really big vet bill from a naive beginner, I really like the way that you went about inviting people over and picking their brain about things, because, I think one of the great things about farming, especially, I think it's always been part of the farming culture, is being able to visit with your neighbors and your friends and tap into that community of people that know. I think sometimes it's a little tough, though, in rural places because not everybody, like some people, like we would ask questions too, like you had just said,
Mhm.
reflecting back and thinking about, oh, I wonder if they thought that question was really crazy. I chuckled to
Yeah.
myself when you said that because we've asked a few of those crazy questions
Yeah.
too. But I think the important thing that I would like the listeners to take away from this is that you have to be willing to be adventurous and curious. You have to be flexible and adaptable, willing to like
Mhm.
try new things, right?
Absolutely.
And um, I think one of the things that was challenging for us is we were in the same lane as you were, as we really were looking at human health and our children
Mm.
and wanting to have good food for our children to eat, you know?
Mhm.
And that isn't necessarily what's on the mind of our neighbors, you know,
Yeah.
always, right? And
Mhm.
where we live, we're one of the few people that have animals on the land. Um, some places like where you're at, there's a few more people grazing animals than down where we live. But I, I find that always interesting. And they're curious because they think we're crazy for trying what they're trying. But I think that there's an element of nostalgia involved because
Mhm.
we see people taking a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon drive, and they're coming down our county road, and they slow down because they want to see the steers
Mhm.
out in the pasture, right? Because they don't,
Yeah.
they kind of remember when they were kids and they were growing up and there were animals on the land a lot.
Mhm.
And we've really moved away from that with some of the practices that we have. And there seems to be a resurgence of people like us that are wanting to put animals back on the land and wanting to have them eat the things that they were meant to eat,
Mhm.
cows and steers' stomachs aren't designed to eat corn. They're
Mhm.
they're meant to graze. They're animals that are meant to graze. And so I think there's something really beautiful about the fact that you're able to do that with your kids. And we alluded to it a little bit earlier in the segment that you have 6 children.
Mhm.
And, you also homeschool them, right?
Yes. Mhm.
And so maybe you could speak a little bit about, like, what are some of the ways that you have been able to integrate the kids' learning experiences into the work on the farm? Or do any of them I know I have 3 kids, and they're all very different personalities, and some really like being on the farm, and some of them don't as much. Or maybe it depends on the age that they're in. Because when they're younger, it's
Mhm.
really cool, but when they get to be teenagers, maybe not so cool, I don't know. But maybe you
Yep.
could talk a little bit about your experience, integrating your family into the farm.
Yeah. When we first started farming our kids, we had just the first four, and they were 6, 4, 2, and 1. And so we started with really little kids. Um, and we kind of just grew our farm as they grew. The size of our farm grew. But it was just really important to me all along the way that we could have the type of farm that our kids could be involved in, that we wouldn't have, need all the big equipment to accomplish small jobs around the farm. And so, just anything from collecting eggs to helping to milk the cow, to feeding bottle lambs, that sort of thing when they were younger. They just really had a hand in it. Our first barn that we lambed out of, we had to hand clean. So they had a lot of hours spent together hand cleaning the barn. And we read a few in our homeschooling. I remember we had read Farmer Boy, and the kids kind of commenting on, boy, this feels like then, except we don't eat like they did, with all their big meals that they had. Um, but and just as our farm has grown, they've been able to take on more responsibility. They're all very capable of doing everything on the farm as far as running the equipment that we do have. We don't have a lot, but with the construction company, we've kind of had loaders and different things around early on, which was extremely helpful to be able to have that equipment that we could share some. And so that's been just neat to see. They all know how to fence and do those things. Pretty much all of my children can back a trailer better than I can. it's amazing at those when they're learning some of these skills at younger ages, just that confidence and that worry isn't there about all the things that can go wrong. I have a little harder time sometimes with them running or doing certain things, but my husband ran equipment and did things from a very young age. So he's kind of good about teaching, helping to teach them and assuring me that it will be okay. So that's kind of been a letting go for me, and they do great, and they're cautious and responsible and all that. So that part has been really neat to see. I think all of our kids, they enjoy the farm. They enjoy having grown up on the farm. Our older two are both in college right now. One is post-secondary and one has graduated from high school and in college. And, I'm not sure how many will come back or be involved in ag in some way. I think some won't, and I think some might eventually in some form, but they all have so far looked at it positively. And we just, it's what our family does. And so it's something that our kids are involved in, but, we've been clear with them that there'll be a place for them if they want to come back and work alongside us. And if they don't want to, that's okay too. There's no expecting that they should carry it on.
That is something that a lot of farm families really think about because farming can be generational, and there's a lot of things that impact families' ability to continue that legacy of farming.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the reasons why a lot of families can't continue at times is because of the uncertainty of farming, and there's so many things that impact the viability of farming. One of the things that we're particularly interested in and seems to be a global national topic is climate, and the intersection between climate and agriculture and what's happening as the planet warms. Our biomes are changing, and that's impacting the way that we can grow what we grow and raise what we raise. Can you tell us a little bit about what you might be seeing related to climate and how that impacts your family operation?
Yeah, our entire operation really is centered around working with and mimicking nature. We don't always succeed at that, but it's definitely a goal that we have, just observing each piece of land and how it's changing. You can just learn so much. Again, just kind of going out, like I had said earlier, after these big weather events, going out on the land and really looking at it. And I remember I was caught out in just a really heavy downpour one day on one of our pastures, and even just watching. Just the cows always like to walk the same path, so when they're going to the water or different things, even though we're rotationally grazing them, there's one spot where they just always walk in that spot. And it was just a narrow little path, and just watching the water flow down that was really eye-opening. And so just making those little tweaks on our farm, if it's moving a temporary fence so that they can't keep walking in that same spot, and just making those, just being aware and making those small changes really do lead to bigger changes overall on the farm. And it doesn't take fancy equipment. It doesn't, it doesn't even take a ton of time if you're just kind of open to observing and making those changes.
That is a good example. One of the nice things about grazing, if you've got temporary fencing, you can put paddocks up and move the animals and control where they graze and how long they graze. Do you use mob grazing, or how long do you usually keep your animals on the pasture, a section of pasture?
Again, it's really just varied with the piece of land that we're on, what our goal is for that piece of land. There's some, just my time in general, what's going on, with our family and kind of balancing family life with the farm. Yes, it'd be great to move everything every day and really, or multiple times a day. But I typically pick one or two pieces a year that I just really want to focus on or really set a specific goal for. And then for that time period, then I might move usually once a day, sometimes even a little more often, where I'll mob the cows, bunch them up tight, and then move them through there. And I've seen really great benefits to that as far as that land respond really, really well. To that, we have most of our land is divided up into smaller permanent paddocks. Most of the paddocks would last for about 7 days with our herd size. And then I do a lot of subdividing with there, just with step-in posts and temporary wire. My husband kind of rigged up my gator for me, so I have a whole system there where I can put up a temporary fence pretty fast. And but we love the flexibility. If we have a summer trip or something, we can just leave the cows in a little bigger area and have somebody check on them, but not have to worry about the moving them quite so often.
That is one of the advantages of pasturing the animals, is that you don't have to feed them twice a day, and you just have to make sure they have access to water, and
Yes,
they pretty much manage themselves and their eating.
they
Um,
do.
Now that you've been into this for a while, if you were to do this again and you were to start over, is there anything that you would do differently based on what you've learned?
There would be a lot, I think, that I would do differently. We would definitely invest way less in equipment and more in livestock early on. We had one of the first things we bought was a tractor and a kind of after we started having, really not that many animals, and a feed wagon for that, and which I had zero interest in running. And so then it, always took my husband to feed the animals, and we sold that off quite a few years ago, thankfully. But so definitely less on that equipment side. I wish I would have just been a little bit more confident in my abilities, or in my ability. I really didn't have many abilities when it came to farming, but in my ability to learn new things. I did rely a lot on my husband because I was nervous about something. And, it took me a couple of years before, instead of just saying, can you go do this, I would say, can you teach me how to do this? And that's really when I noticed myself finding so much more joy, and being able to kind of take the farm a little more the direction I wanted to go, was when I started kind of focusing on those skills I was lacking, and building them up, and just figuring out what I liked and what I didn't like, and being okay with that changing over the years. That if I tried something and didn't like it, it was okay. And again, just really watching that investment in each enterprise, so that you're not so heavily invested that you can't change directions. For example, when we first got sheep, for the first couple of years, I wouldn't tag them, and I wouldn't even give them shots. I'm actually a nurse. And that's what I went to college for, and I was terrified to give the sheep a shot. My husband started traveling for work more, and so then I was kind of forced into it. And now it just kind of feels silly to me that I wouldn't do that in the beginning.
It just dawned on me that I didn't even ask you, through your operation, do you sell off the farm?
Products, you mean?
Yep.
Yep. So we sell pork and beef. Off our farm. We have all our freezer storages here, and we direct sell to consumers. We've done some restaurants, in like online markets and various things in the past. I've just found that I'm happiest selling directly to consumers. Obviously, COVID kind of changed that model a little bit too, as far as, the restaurants that we were selling to kind of stopped during COVID. But then, of course, our direct sales really picked up last year, where we were sold out, in faster than we ever have been. So I'm not sure what it will look like in the coming year. But that's just been the model that I've kind of liked the best. And then our sheep are all sold on contract, and those we don't sell directly from the farm anymore. We did for a time. But.
Was it hard for you to establish your markets and establish your off-farm sales?
It took some time. I'm not a salesperson at all. But I also do love talking about what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it. We used a ton of social media to kind of grow and build those markets in the beginning, and that was huge. And just kind of advertised through there in different areas, and kind of got a really good base customer list. And then from there, it's just expanded by word of mouth and that sort of thing. And I mean, we've just had so many faithful customers that have really just stuck with us, and have been really just patient with sometimes when they've had to wait, if we have a few months where no animals are going in, and adjusting their eating habits to the timing of our animals and when we take them in for processing.
That is always the challenge. I always found it funny when we have hogs for sale and people just want bacon.
Yep.
And helping people understand how to use the whole animal. And, in one of our previous presentations, it was shared that they even provide recipes for customers to give them ideas of how to maybe cook and prepare some of the more unusual cuts that come with an animal.
Mhm.
And I think even when we were visiting, you said that you did some research on recipes for lamb and tried
Mhm.
to share those with folks to encourage them to try something new, because lamb isn't necessarily something that people out here maybe grew up with or are accustomed to, and so they might be a little bit more hesitant to try something. And once you establish a relationship with a customer, they're more willing to maybe try something new, we found.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I think that that's important. We've talked a lot about things today. Is there anything else at the moment that you can think of that you would like to share with those listening in today?
I can't really.
I'm going to have a check the chat. As we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, if you have some questions that you'd like to ask Jessica, you can type them into the chat and we will ask her. There's a couple of them coming up right now. The first one here, Jessica says, what are some of the biggest inputs into the kinds of operations that you have? So, like when you've had to amend the soil, perhaps, aside from doing cover crops, what kind of inputs did you use, if any at all?
We honestly have used very few inputs. It's just an area that I'm not comfortable using a lot in. We have done some fertilizing when we planted new grass seedings on certain pieces of land, but I've just found that having the animals on pasture and grazing and focusing on that gets us the results cheaper, and just has longer lasting results than those other synthetic inputs. But we definitely have used things here and there over the years. A lot of times, we'll cut the recommended rate back. Then what they'll tell us, we use the Haney soil test, and we tend to base our rating off of that over a traditional soil test, and that's helped. But for us, the biggest input in our system really is that fencing, and then the water systems that we use, getting water to places that don't have water. We have one pasture that has a solar well. And so that's kind of where we focus our time and money, is on that fencing, so that we can get those animals out there.
So where you're located, are there conventional farmers around you? One of the questions came up is, in the last windstorm that we had towards the end of winter, one of the participants noticed that there was an awful lot of dirt blowing around, and that the snow was covered in dirt. Do you have that around your farm with your neighbors adjacent to your properties? Do you get their topsoil? Does it benefit you?
Yes, there's definitely a lot of soil blowing around. I mean, we kind of have a mix because of the nature of our land. It's hilly and light soil. And then we also have a state park near us. There's, on some of our pieces, we're surrounded by all pasture. very little tillable. Some pieces, it's all tillable. And we definitely, I mean, there was so much soil in our ditch this year just from a field that's just north of us. And, you know, you see it on the snow, and you see it in these last 2 days too, with the wind, the way it's been just blowing around. And it's really hard to see all that just going downstream.
It is. We have a lot of that over by us, and my kids were even, you know, it's kind of funny. We kind of play landscape bingo when we're driving in the car.
Mhm.
And it's anything from what identify that crop, or identify that wildflower in the ditch, or identify that tile spigot coming out into the ditch. It's kind of funny, but Greg's asking if you've ever pastured pigs. And you have said, he's asking if you have interest in chickens, but I think you've said you do have a few chickens, right?
Yeah, so we've had anything from meat birds to laying hens. Last year I bought, I think it was like 130 laying hens, and my husband built me a chicken tractor for out on the field and kind of followed them along behind the cows. And it was fun seeing the chickens out there scratching around. We did lose a lot to predators. They did really good for the first half of summer. And then towards fall, they started disappearing quickly, and chickens are hard to count. So sometimes they're kind of like sheep. You don't realize that there's a lot missing until there's a lot missing. There's some things we could do to make that better and try again. So it's not something we're giving up on by any means. There's just some minor adjustments that we'll make and maybe try with a few less, so I know if any are being carried off and I can actually count them. Our pigs, we've also done a same variety with. We've had them out on our pastures, usually just close to home because of the small number that we have, and use different temporary fence options with them. I'm still kind of learning with pigs. You know, some we've been able to train to electric netting, and some we've had a harder time training, or had issues with them running at the netting and getting caught in it. So just kind of a big learning curve there as far as pigs go, but it's, you know, when they are out there, it's really fun to see them out there digging around and just being a pig.
Yeah, they definitely tend to root everything up. They're great for the grove if you're trying to clean out buckthorn or clean out your grove. Basically, they root up everything, right?
Yep.
So one of the things you referenced was a chicken tractor. So for those of you out there who might not know what a chicken tractor is, it's not really a tractor per se. Because when somebody first tried to explain that to me, I was envisioning like a tractor, but it's an enclosure that usually it can be made of a lot of things. It's usually made lightweight so you can move it around on the pasture, but it's an enclosed area that is covered, has a little bit of shade, has a place for them to roost and have water and sometimes feed. But it basically helps you move the chickens around on the pasture, and they tend to break up the manure a little bit quicker. So that works its way into the soil a little quicker. There are different sizes depending on how many birds you want to put in them. One of the questions I had for you, Jess, were, did you know what predators were getting your chickens at all?
I'm not sure if it was coyote or fox. We're not quite sure. In our chicken tractor, what we did is we just took a old rusted out livestock trailer. So it's like an old gooseneck trailer. And my husband put a new floor in it that's open. And so then when they're in there, all the manure and stuff would just go down, but they would have in and out access from there. And then I just had electric netting around the area that they were in.
Okay.
To kind of help protect them. And then to move that particular, because it's pretty big, you know, we just have to hook the loader or whatever on it and just pull it to move it. Yeah. And we do a lot of bale grazing too. And so then having those chickens out there is really helpful too, because they'll get in those kind of matted hay piles and move those around too. It's amazing how much work a chicken can do, you know, and not that much time.
Work or damage. It depends on where they get. They're not as bad as goats, but they do sometimes get into places they're not supposed to.
Yep.
So we had a really bad year for predators this year too, and we lost about 80 chickens, and
Okay. Mm-hmm.
we believe it was coyotes that were sneaking in to get them, especially because they like to go into the grove. And so it got to the point where we ended up having to expand our run and not let them out as much, unless we used to just let them out and then we'd be gone all day and come back kind of thing. But we would only let them out when we were around more, because it was just getting to be too crazy. It's like you say, you don't really notice it until you really notice it, and then pretty detrimental. One of Angela is asking what you do for feed in the winter. Like, do you purchase it or do you raise your own feed for the winter? How do you go about feeding your animals in the winter?
We've mostly grown our own hay. We kind of rotate areas that we're cutting for hay, so that we're not always cutting the same area. We do have haying equipment, but actually we've custom hired, because my husband's been so busy. We've custom hired our haying for the last couple years. We have a few people that are willing to do that for us, and they have the bigger, better equipment. So that works out really well. I'm trying to convince my husband that we should just sell all our haying equipment, but we'll see about that one. So they eat hay. I've kind of gone mostly to bale grazing for our cows, for our cattle and cows and everything. This winter, I took our out on a pasture. I took 3 different paddocks and subdivided them. We pounded posts in the ground, and I used a little heavier temporary wire and put out hay bales for, I think I had like 3 months worth out there. And so then all I had to do was go out and just open up one wire in order to let them through to a certain number of bales and eat. And I've been really happy with that. That was nice. Most years we've always fed hay in the winter, but some years I don't have as many bales out in the beginning. And so then we run into mucking up some of the land just by going out on heavy equipment. If all of a sudden they need hay and it's muddy, or, when we have these freeze thaw cycles, it can just be really hard on the land.
Haven't really thought about that, but that is a good strategy for getting access to feed in the winter. Angela is also asking what you do for water with the animals on pasture. Do you have a water line that runs on the fence, or do you haul water out to tubs? What do you do?
We pretty much put good watering systems, deep buried water systems in every one of our pastures. And then, most of our pastures do have winter waterers on them, so that we can rotate where we keep the cattle even in the winter. And the sheep end up kind of more on a dry lot, because we lamb, in early spring. And so they're not out as much in the winter. But for the cattle, we've just really found that saves a lot of time to just that our animals always have that water. And then we put in hydrants at certain points, so that then when I'm subdividing paddocks, I can either just run a hose over ground to where I need to go, or kind of have a central water point and just kind of wagon wheel my paddocks out from that watering point. So it makes us so much more flexible, with how we set up our paddocks when you have that water system there. So I've hauled water some in the past, but it's so time consuming, and it works and we can do it, but it takes a ton of time.
Greg is asking, what could a grain farmer do to incorporate animals on the land without owning or tending them? Or do they have to learn something like they did when you buy animals and fence?
We have a neighbor that has a really large operation, and they're they grow grain, and they're have a ton of pasture too, but they for a lot of our neighbors in the area, they go and will plant cover crops on neighboring fields, and then they run their cattle there. They do all the fencing that they need. They just set up temporary fencing for their cows. So, I think if you're only a grain farmer, if you grain farm, there's people around that are willing to come and run animals on your land. And I think just timing and, just kind of making sure you're checking in with what the next crop is and if they're planting covers. You just want to just be sure that you're on the same page as far as when the animals go on and when they leave.
Well, Jessica, I just want to thank you for sharing your story and your journey on the land with us and your family, opening up your family to a wider audience and giving us some of the lessons that you've learned. So thank you. I also just want to thank and lift up some of our partners in this work. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this project was part of a bigger year-long project that we did called We Are Water, West Central Minnesota. And this was one of the programs that we did as part of that bigger project. And we worked with Troy Goodnow at the University of Minnesota Morris in the Office of Sustainability, Judy Johnston from Stevens County Soil and Water Conservation District, Brian DeVore and Robin Moore from the Land Stewardship Project, and thanks to the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships at the University of Minnesota Extensions for some funding to help with this project. If you enjoyed today's webinar, our next one, installment 4, is going to be on Tuesday, April 20th, and we're going to be speaking with Mark Erickson. And Mark's interesting in the fact that he doesn't own land that he uses. He rents land and he convinces landowners to convert their conventional farmland to pasture. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, join us on Tuesday, April 30th at noon. Remember that these webinars will be available on the Cure YouTube page at Cure River. And we'll edit this one and have it up in its entirety probably in the next week or so for you to look at. I just want to thank you again, Jess, for joining us and enjoy. We were worried that we weren't going to be able to manage today's webinar because of all the wind, because sometimes in rural places, the weather creates instability in the internet connections, but we managed to get it done today. Yes. So that was exciting. And so we appreciate that and enjoy some of this beautiful sunshine. One of our other partners that was talking at the beginning said that, I think it's safe to say that spring is officially here. We're starting to see little things come up and we're excited about that, the warmer weather for a variety of reasons. So thank you again and good luck with this season and your animals. And thank you everyone for joining us. And please join us again on the 20th of April. Bye-bye.